Here is something that will mess with your head. The United States of America, the country that invented the assembly line, that built the interstate highway system, that put a man on the moon, is also the country where a restaurant worker can be legally paid $2.13 an hour by their employer. $2.13. That is the federal tipped minimum wage as of the time this script was written, and it has not moved in over 3 decades. The assumption baked into that number is that customers, not employers, will pay the rest of the worker's wage through tips. And somehow the rest of the world looks at this arrangement and cannot believe it is real. Today we are going to pull back the curtain on one of the most misunderstood, most argued about, and most uniquely American customs in the country. Where tipping actually came from, why Americans embraced it when the rest of the world moved on, and the part that almost nobody talks about, the fact that there was once a powerful movement in this country to ban tipping entirely, and the people who killed that movement did it for reasons that will make you angry. This is a story about labor, about race, about power, about psychology, and about a legal system that was shaped by lobbyists in ways that Americans still live with every single day. Let me take you through it. First, let us get something out of the way that you may have heard and that is completely false. You have probably seen it on a playmat at a diner or in a forwarded email from a relative. The claim that the word tip is actually an acronym, that it stands for "to ensure promptness," or some variation of that phrase. It is a clever story. It is also almost certainly a backronym, meaning someone invented the acronym after the word already existed to explain a word whose origins were already murky. Linguists and etymologists who have studied this are in broad agreement. There is no credible historical documentation linking the word tip to any acronym. The word appears in English texts centuries before that explanation was ever recorded. So the next time someone at the table says it, you now know. It is a myth. And honestly, the real story of where tipping comes from is far more interesting than a made-up acronym anyway. The actual roots of tipping go back to Europe, specifically to England in the 17th and 18th centuries. If you were a wealthy English aristocrat visiting another wealthy family's estate, it was customary to leave money for the household servants. You were a guest, they served you, you rewarded them privately before you left. This practice gradually migrated from private homes into public establishments, inns, coffee houses, taverns. Servers in these places came to expect a small sum above the bill from well-to-do customers. It was a class transaction as much as anything else. The wealthy patron acknowledged the service worker's effort in a way the formal wage structure did not. Now here is where America enters the picture, and here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. For most of the 19th century, tipping was not an American thing. In fact, many Americans actively considered it a European affectation, something that belonged in the class-stratified societies of the Old World, not in a democratic republic that had fought a revolution precisely to get away from that kind of hierarchy. There was a real cultural resistance to the idea that some people were naturally servants and that money slipped into a palm was how you acknowledged that relationship. It felt wrong to a lot of Americans. Aristocratic, un-American. But in the decades following the Civil War, something changed. Wealthy Americans began traveling to Europe in larger numbers than ever before. They came back with European fashions, European art, European habits, and some of them came back with European tipping. They began leaving gratuities at American restaurants and hotels, signaling that they were sophisticated, that they had been abroad, that they knew how things were done in the finer establishments of London and Paris. Tipping spread, slowly at first, then faster, as a status symbol imported from the continent.
The workers who received those tips were, for the most part, not unhappy about them. More money in your pocket is more money in your pocket. But here is what was happening at the institutional level. Some employers began to realize that if customers were tipping their workers, those employers could justify paying lower base wages. The tips were, in effect, transferring part of the employer's labor cost onto the customer. And that logic, which should have made Americans furious, instead became quietly embedded in the structure of certain industries. No industry embedded it more deliberately or more cynically than the railroad. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the Pullman Company. George Pullman built his fortune manufacturing sleeping cars for railroads, those elegant private compartments that let wealthy passengers sleep comfortably on long overnight journeys. Pullman cars were luxurious, and they required attentive service. Someone had to carry luggage, make up the sleeping berths, shine shoes, bring food and drink, and respond to every passenger request at any hour of the night. The men who did that work were called Pullman porters. After the Civil War, George Pullman made a deliberate decision to hire almost exclusively black men, many of them formerly enslaved, for the porter positions. His reasoning was not benevolent. He believed black workers would be more deferential to white passengers, more willing to absorb indignity without complaint, and could be paid significantly less than what white workers would accept. He kept their wages extraordinarily low and justified this partly on the expectation that passengers would tip. Tipping was not incidental to the Pullman system. It was structural. It was the mechanism that let George Pullman pay poverty wages while pointing to gratuities as proof that his workers were being taken care of.
For the porters themselves, the situation was complicated. Tips from wealthy passengers could meaningfully supplement what the company paid. Some Pullman porters, over time, built middle-class lives for themselves and their families, a remarkable achievement given the circumstances. Historians have documented that Pullman porters formed one of the most prominent black professional classes in early 20th century America. They traveled the country, gained exposure to different cities and ideas, and became important figures in the broader struggle for civil rights. A. Philip Randolph organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the 1920s, eventually winning a union contract in 1937, one of the first major labor victories for black workers in American history. But the legacy of the Pullman tipping system was not neutral. It had established a template: pay certain workers less, particularly workers from marginalized groups, and justify the low wages by pointing to tips. That template did not disappear. It evolved. By the early 20th century, tipping had spread enough in America that a backlash was brewing, and this backlash was serious. Several states actually passed laws making tipping illegal. Washington State, among others, banned the practice outright in the early 1900s. A man named William Scott published a book in 1916 called The Itching Palm, arguing that tipping was fundamentally incompatible with American democratic values. His argument was straightforward. In a society of equals, you should not be expected to pay a gratuity to another person simply for doing their job. The proper solution was for employers to pay fair wages, full stop. Tipping created a servile relationship, one person bowing and scraping for an extra dollar, that had no place in a country built on the dignity of labor. The anti-tipping movement had real momentum. It reflected something genuine in the American character, a discomfort with hierarchy, a belief that wages should reflect the value of work rather than the whims of individual customers. And for a moment, it looked like tipping might actually die out in America, the way it eventually did in much of the rest of the world.
It did not die out. The anti-tipping laws were largely unenforceable and were eventually repealed. The restaurant and hospitality industries, which had come to depend on the low-wage plus tips model, pushed back hard. And then something happened that locked the system in place more firmly than anything before it: the federal minimum wage. When the United States established a federal minimum wage in the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, the restaurant industry lobbied aggressively for an exception. Their argument was that tipped workers were different. Customers were already supplementing their income, so they did not need the same floor that other workers had. What emerged from that lobbying was the concept of the tipped minimum wage, a legally lower base wage for workers who regularly received gratuities, on the theory that tips would make up the difference. If a worker's combined wages plus tips did not reach the full minimum wage in a given pay period, the employer was technically required to make up the gap. In practice, that backstop was, and remains, difficult to enforce and widely unenforced. Over the decades, the federal minimum wage rose several times, but the tipped minimum wage did not keep pace. There was a specific moment in the 1990s when Congress agreed to raise the regular federal minimum wage, but agreed to freeze the tipped minimum wage at $2.13 per hour, a compromise that benefited the restaurant industry enormously and that has never been undone at the federal level. That number, $2.13, is what it remains today for tipped workers in states that follow the federal standard. Some states have gone their own way. California, Washington, Oregon, Minnesota, and a handful of others have eliminated the tipped minimum wage entirely, requiring that all workers receive the same base pay regardless of tips. But in the majority of American states, the tipped wage floor remains far below the regular minimum wage, and the expectation that customers will bridge the gap is built into the entire economic model of American food service.
This is the thing that visitors from other countries find genuinely difficult to process. When a European or Australian tourist sits down in an American restaurant, they are not just ordering food, they are unknowingly stepping into an employment relationship they were not told about. The price on the menu does not include what the server needs to earn a living. The tip is not a bonus for exceptional service, it is, in the American system, a core component of the worker's wage, and the guilt and social pressure embedded in that system are doing real work to enforce it. You tip, not just because the service was good, but because you understand that if you do not, the person who just brought your food may not be able to pay rent. Now let us talk about what the rest of the world actually does instead, because the contrast is striking. In Japan, tipping is not just uncommon, it's considered rude. If you leave money on the table, a server may chase you down the street to return it. Japanese culture holds that service is part of the job, that workers are paid to do it, and that offering a gratuity implies the employer is not paying fairly, which is an insult both to the worker and to the establishment. Quality service is a professional standard, not something to be purchased separately. Australia has built high minimum wages for hospitality workers into law, and the culture of tipping, while not unknown, carries nothing like the moral weight it does in America. In much of Western Europe, restaurant bills often include a service charge by law, or servers are simply paid wages that reflect the full value of their labor, making tips a genuine optional gesture rather than a substitute paycheck.
The result in those countries is something that sounds obvious when you say it out loud. Service workers know exactly what they will earn before they show up to work. Their income is not a function of whether the customers at their tables are generous or stingy, whether it is a slow Tuesday or a busy Saturday, whether the kitchen made a mistake that was not the server's fault. American servers, by contrast, can work a full shift and bring home almost nothing if the tipping is bad. They can be shorted by customers who disagree with the tipping expectation, by customers who are having a bad day, by customers who have absorbed the myth that a smaller tip teaches the server a lesson, when in reality, the lesson the server takes home is that they cannot make rent. And here is the part that the psychological research makes genuinely uncomfortable. Studies on tipping behavior, and there is a substantial body of this research, including work from researchers at Cornell University who have spent years studying how and why people tip, suggest that the amount customers tip correlates remarkably poorly with objective service quality. It correlates much more strongly with things like the server's physical appearance, the server's race, the size of the bill, whether the server crouches to make eye contact, whether the server introduces themselves by name, whether the server touches the customer briefly on the arm. These are not measures of service quality. They are measures of performance and likability, filtered through the biases and comfort levels of the individual customer. The mythology of tipping is that it's a meritocracy. You get what you earn what you deserve. The data says otherwise. There's also the question of what tipping does to the culture of the workplace itself. American servers, because their income depends so heavily on individual customer satisfaction, sometimes find themselves in situations where they must absorb treatment from customers that workers in other industries would never tolerate. Complaints, rudeness, unreasonable demands. A server who pushes back risks losing a tip they cannot afford to lose. This dynamic, where the worker's economic security is held partly hostage to the approval of the customer, creates conditions that researchers and labor advocates have described as a structural vulnerability, one that disproportionately affects women who make up a significant share of tipped restaurant workers and workers of color.
Now add to all of this the most recent chapter of the tipping story, which is something that millions of Americans are currently experiencing and arguing about in real time. The rise of digital payment systems, the tablets and screens that sit at coffee shop counters and food truck windows, has produced what some economists and journalists have taken to calling tipflation or tip creep. Suddenly, a tip prompt appears when you are picking up a bag you ordered online. A tip prompt appears when you buy a scoop of ice cream from someone who scooped it in 15 seconds. A tip prompt appears when you are ringing up your own groceries at a self-checkout kiosk. The social anxiety of the screen turned toward you, the cashier watching you choose no tip, the little moment of judgment that digital payment systems have injected into transactions that never had it before. This is new, it is spreading, and it is making Americans feel something they do not have a clean word for. Not quite guilt, not quite anger, something in between. Part of what makes this moment interesting is that it is forcing a conversation that Americans have been avoiding for a long time. If tipping is everywhere, if it covers not just servers at sit-down restaurants, but baristas, rideshare drivers, delivery workers, food truck operators, hotel housekeepers, airport shuttle drivers, then the original rationale for the tipped minimum wage starts to feel even more strained. The argument was always that servers in full-service restaurants were different, that the relationship between server and customer was close enough and long enough that generous tipping was a natural and reliable result. Apply that logic to a 3-minute coffee transaction, and it stops making sense. Apply it to a digital platform where you tip before you have even received the service, and it makes even less sense than that. What you are watching, if you are paying attention, is the beginning of what may be a real reckoning with a system that was built on a very specific set of historical conditions: the aftermath of slavery, the lobbying power of the restaurant industry, the cultural import of European aristocratic habits by wealthy Americans who wanted to seem sophisticated, and that has now metastasized into something far larger than any of those original conditions can justify. Several cities and states have experimented with no-tipping restaurant models, where the price on the menu reflects the full cost of the meal, including a fair wage for everyone in the building. Some of those experiments have succeeded, some have struggled, partly because American diners, despite complaining loudly about tipping, are not always comfortable paying menu prices that honestly reflect the cost of service. The psychology runs deep. And that is the thing about tipping in America that is hardest to untangle. It is not just a labor policy. It is not just a wage structure. It is a cultural habit encoded with American beliefs about individualism, about merit, about the relationship between a customer and the person who serves them. The idea that you personally reward the person who served you well, that you are the judge of their quality, that your dollar is a direct expression of your assessment, fits neatly into a certain vision of American freedom and individual agency. What gets lost in that vision is the worker who has no base wage worth speaking of, the employer who has successfully transferred their labor cost onto the dining public, and the history that built this system in the first place. It is worth sitting with that history.
not to feel bad about leaving a tip. The server needs it under the current system, and withholding it punishes the wrong person entirely. But to understand that the discomfort millions of Americans feel about tipping right now is not irrational. It is the friction of a system showing its age. It is a recognition, growing slowly across the country, that the arrangement we inherited was not designed with the worker's dignity in mind. It was designed to move a cost from the employer to the customer while keeping the worker dependent enough that they could not afford to refuse what the customer gave them.
The anti-tipping movement of the early 20th century lost. The restaurant lobby won, and Americans have been living with the results ever since, negotiating the social math of 18% versus 20% at the end of every meal, asking themselves whether the service was good enough, whether they can afford to be generous today, whether the person clearing their plates is going to be okay this month. That is a weight that most of the developed world does not ask its citizens to carry. Understanding why America carries it, where it came from, who built it, who profits from it, is the first step toward an honest conversation about whether it has to stay this way. So the next time you are staring at that little screen at the coffee counter, or doing the mental math at the end of a restaurant meal, or watching a visitor from abroad squint at the tip line on their receipt in genuine confusion, remember that what you are looking at is not tradition for tradition's sake. It is history. It is policy. It is a set of choices that were made that benefited some people and cost others, and that can, in principle, be made differently. The question is whether Americans, who have always prided themselves on the idea that a fair day's work deserves a fair day's pay, are ready to apply that principle to the people who clear their tables and carry their bags. Leave me a comment below. I want to know where you stand on this. Have you worked a tipped job? Did the system work for you? Or did it feel like the floor was always about to give out? And if you have traveled internationally and experienced the no tipping culture firsthand, tell me how it felt compared to what you were used to at home. Those stories from real people are some of the best conversations in this comment section. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone, because this is exactly the kind of story that deserves a wider audience. Subscribe if you want more American history that never quite made it into the textbook, and I will see you in the next one.